Hi, we're going to talk a little bit about the French and Indian War. Winston Churchill called it the First World War because of all the involvement and all the fighting from Europe to North America. If you took an AP European history class, it probably would have been called the 7 Years' War. But it actually lasts 9 years over here in North America, from 1754 to 1763. It's called the French and Indian War because that's primarily who we are fighting. We, the British North American colonies, along with, of course, Britain, and a few Native Americans, fight the French and many of their Native American allies. Most of the tribal nations sided with France because France's economy was a little bit less oppressive and a little bit less restrictive and intrusive to the Native Americans, where the British primarily were interested in farming, which is wanting to take over land to farm. The French, their economy, much of it was trading with the French, trading between the French and Native Americans for furs and pelts to bring back to Europe. What's kind of interesting about the French and Indian War is it ends with strong British patriotism here in the North American colonies. But when it ends in 1763, just 13 years later, 1776, we're declaring independence. Thomas Jefferson, Declaration of Independence. So how did we go from feeling such strong British patriotism to wanting to declare our independence and break off and by war if necessary? Well, Britain comes out of the war thinking two primarily things. Number one is they're in large debt, especially from the French and Indian War. And number two is the American colonies are just becoming too much of a headache. Debts, wars, fighting, that they need to solve some of this fighting. So they start coming up with a few ideas to try to reduce their debt and prevent future conflicts, to prevent future debt from piling up. So Britain, for the first few times, they start coming up with their first unified colonial policy that applies to all 13 of the original colonies, not just to one or two. And this is striking to a lot of the American colonists as well. But more importantly here, they say, well, we need to protect our colonial interests. We need to protect our interests. So we need permanent troops stationed. So for the first time in colonial history, after the French and Indian War, you have permanent troops located here in America. The Quartering Act of 1765 is to help alleviate some of the funding because the troops get to be barracked, housed inside American homes, which is why you see in our U.S. Constitution the actual fear of a government putting troops inside homes, quartering troops. And these troops, they would take jobs. A lot of these soldiers, they have some free time. They're not paid extremely well, but so they want to make some money on the side. And some people say, cities like Boston, eventually before the Declaration of Independence, they're eventually going to get about 1/4 of their population, roughly, being British soldiers, many of which are taking jobs or just intruding upon the American homes. So you see the Quartering Act, which is very, very controversial and very, very much despised by the Americans. And well, how did they tackle the debt? Well, the Sugar Act, taxing sugar, molasses, 1764, the Currency Act, 1764 as well here. And the Currency Act taxed and tried to prevent Americans from printing their own paper currency. This is the British Prime Minister Grenville's, his way of trying to tackle this problem post-French and Indian War. The most significant I'm going to talk in good detail about here is the Stamp Act, because it's an act that unifies a lot of American resentment and angers a lot of the Americans. So when you look at the Stamp Act, you can see here in 1765, it leads to the Stamp Act Congress. The Stamp Act Congress is very important because it meets in New York City just for a couple weeks in October of 1765 in New York City. But the Stamp Act Congress is the first time where you have several colonies meeting together to address a grievance or to try to organize resistance to a British policy from the mother country. And this is very, very, very important because you're starting to see American go from 13 colonies that are separated to starting to, at least initially, taking those baby steps to acting as one that you're going to see later on with the Continental Congress. The Sons of Liberty are very, very, very instrumental in drumming up resistance towards the Stamp Act. The Sons of Liberty, people like Samuel Adams, put out lots of correspondence, lots of pamphlets, are very, very talented at drumming up support on behalf of the colonial resistance to the Stamp Act. And remember, the Stamp Act was so controversial that Americans actually ransacked the office and homes of British colonial officials in Boston in protest and resistance to the Stamp Act. What exactly was the Stamp Act? Well, there was a tax on printed goods. You know, it could be a newspaper, it could be some type of a legal license or some type of a deed, playing cards, printed goods. And you'd have to buy a stamp and affix it to the printed document, the printed pamphlet, whatever, to show that you paid the tax for having that good. The British thought, you know, we need to pay down this debt. We need to pay down this debt. And this is a good way to do it. But Americans saw it as, you know, you're singling us out. This affects a lot of people. The British thought, you know, it only affected the upper middle class and the upper class. But a lot of Americans resisted this idea, saying that no taxation without representation, you know, that this was trampling upon their local rights that they had, some dating all the way back to the 1600s to be dealing with this sort of thing. Of course, the British said, well, there's virtual representation, that, you know, all members of Parliament represent everyone within the empire. However, a lot of the Americans said, you know, we don't actually want representation in Parliament, because if we're given representation in Parliament, we would be a small minority. We wouldn't have much of a say. And so what they wanted was to keep local autonomy, keep a lot of local control. The Stamp Act was very, 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 very upsetting to a lot of the Americans. And so what's important to remember about that is not just the resistance, but the fact that there's a Stamp Act Congress, that Americans start trying to unify for the first time, like the Stamp Act Congress, the Sons of Liberty. Also, the last part is the Proclamation Line of 1763. This is also trying to prevent future problems, like arguably the Grenville was trying to do with the Quartering Act. The Proclamation Line basically drew a line, and it said that the most obvious geographic feature is the Appalachian Mountains, and that the colonists weren't to go west over the mountains, and the Native Americans weren't to go east over the mountains. And you'd have to be a licensed trapper or trader to have the permission to go over the mountains. The Appalachian Mountains just being the perfect geographic feature to divide east-west. But the problem was it wasn't perfect, because there were a lot of colonists who actually already moved west of the mountains. There were a lot of colonists who had already bought land, even if they hadn't moved west of the mountains. And you would have to, it's basically a policy Britain really can't enforce, because they would have to force many colonists back over the line. You'd have to compensate or at least take away land that had already been acquired by many colonists. And then at the same time, when you look at this, a lot of Americans wanted to expand westward. They believed that they had the right to expand westward, and that they had fought and died and spilled blood for the right to acquire this land and to take this land and to use this land, and to and that they were almost in some type of a duty to utilize this land, to till the land and make the land, you know, tame, the wilderness. And so this is how the French and Indian War starts off actually strengthening the bond between the colonies, but then ends up being one of the main reasons why Britain and her colonies split apart. Remember, Britain's also thinking, the colonies on average are taxed less than people back home in England. And at the same time, the average white colonist is making more money than the average person back in England. And so it's natural to say, well, we fought this war in large part to protect you. Now you need to help pay. But at the same time, the American point of view, just to summarize, we're saying, you're taking away from a lot of our local prerogatives. You're taxing us, just us in that mainland back Britain. And you're taking away from a lot of the autonomy that we've had since the founding of a lot of the colonies. And so it was very, very, very upsetting. And that's how you get a rift that forms from the end of the French and Indian War, 1763, to the Declaration of Independence, 1776. It changes British policy, and in ways that America will not accept.